How does one find the most perfect map in the heart of the 21st century? If you are anything like Ellie Vance, you are going about it entirely wrong. She, and perhaps you as well, are still desperately relying on this glowing screen to navigate the entirety of life. It is truly a pity. Right at this moment, on a Saturday afternoon in the heart of Seattle, Ellie is being submerged in profound tedium, and she genuinely despises that feeling of emptiness. Perhaps you are feeling just as disheartened. You came to this story with the fragile hope of feeling less suffocated, yet in the end, all that appears before your eyes is the image of a young woman aimlessly scrolling her finger across a screen, utterly alone in her own apartment. But hold on a moment, let us see how we might unravel this together. Let us try to zoom in on the paralysis that is currently besieging Ellie's mind. As the frantic wheel of the week's busy tasks finally grinds to a halt, instead of bringing peace, the empty time that unfolds before her eyes resembles an invisible abyss. The human mind often harbors a deep illusion, mistakenly believing that the state of boredom is simply the leisure of having nothing to do, but if we calmly observe, we will realize it is actually a form of dull psychological ache tearing us apart from the inside. That pain is the whispering of existence, warning us that we are losing connection with the vibrant source of our own being. This is the first wake-up call, rousing us from a daydream, because ironically, we are drifting through the golden age of entertainment content while remaining utterly impoverished in terms of meaning. The bustling sounds and brilliant images out there are merely a screen concealing the truth that, when stripped of all means of content consumption, we suddenly find ourselves standing bare in the wasteland of the soul, desperately searching for a true purpose in life amidst a swelling ocean of meaningless things. To escape the invisible abyss quietly swallowing her mind right in the middle of her silent apartment, Ellie chooses to struggle using a familiar instinct of the modern human, which is to pounce on some trivial chore to cling to, hoping to create a false sense of busyness. She turns on her phone, her fingers swiftly swiping back and forth on the screen to delete dozens of useless junk emails and hurriedly block pesky telemarketing calls. In that fleeting moment, her brain seems to release a small dose of soothing chemicals, creating a fragile illusion that she is actually restoring order to her life, that she is doing something useful and productive. Yet, while her mind is busy deceiving itself with these soulless, repetitive actions, the image of Marcus suddenly returns to her thoughts like a silent lighthouse illuminating her soul. Marcus is an older colleague at her workplace, but hidden beneath that ordinary exterior is the silhouette of an anonymous philosopher amidst the suffocating office, someone who always offers sharp perspectives that peel away the glamorous shell of modern civilization. Just the day before, upon witnessing Ellie frantically cleaning out her inbox during her lunch break with a glazed expression, he had smiled calmly and gently exposed the sophisticated trap that she, and all of us, are unconsciously falling into. His warm, deep voice now echoes in Ellie's ears, reminding her that this hurried productivity is not a healing remedy but is actually just a temporary anesthetic meant to soothe the tearing existential pain. When we bury our heads in deleting spam messages, we think we are cleaning up our lives, but in reality, we are selling off our lives' most precious asset, which is our attention. Marcus pointed out a profound and agonizing truth that we are obediently surrendering our raw mental energy to the mindless machines and colossal data mining systems out there. We turn ourselves into volunteer sanitation workers clearing garbage in cyberspace, allowing cold algorithms to manipulate our emotions just to cover up the deep emptiness within our hearts that we dare not face. Marcus once said that whenever we feel relieved for deleting a meaningless file or blocking a spam source, we are not regaining control at all, but are merely participating in a pretend game set up by our own minds to distract from our existential dread. Soothing boredom with trivial tasks does not fill the void of meaning. It is just like trying to empty an ocean of swirling despair with a tiny spoon. The more she tries to clean her digital space, the more Ellie bitterly realizes her inner space is drowning in a suffocating boredom with no way out. She realizes the tedium does not vanish after those decisive screen swipes or those ruthless taps of the block button. It only temporarily retreats into the shadows, stalking and waiting to pounce and tear at her soul the moment her fingers stop. Marcus' words acted like a sharp, compassionate needle puncturing the hollow balloon of her fake busy efforts, forcing Ellie to admit she was using mechanical actions to cover up the terrifying truth that she is completely lost. She, like so many others in this hurried world, does not know what to do with herself when there is no one giving orders, no glowing screen, and no exhausting work to justify her existence. We constantly speak of our desire for peace, yet deep down we are absolutely terrified of silence, terrified of the moment we must sit face to face with our bare ego, only to voluntarily offer ourselves as meaningless spinning cogs in a massive consumption machine. The illusion of usefulness when clearing an inbox is really just a desperate attempt to avoid having to listen to the silent cries of our soul. It exposes a deep paradox of our time, that we would rather endure cognitive exploitation from invisible algorithms, rather slide down into loops of unconditioned reflexes, than sit back for a moment of silence to understand where this profound poverty of meaning originates. The gentle yet resolute awakening from Marcus' words is not meant to pass judgment, but is a profound invitation toward freedom, helping Ellie vaguely realize that as long as she continues to borrow external means to numb her mind, she will remain forever trapped in the abyss of boredom, eternally unable to reach the true liberation silently waiting for her just on the other side of the emptiness. Recalling those piercingly awakening words, the stream of thought carries Ellie back to the previous afternoon, when she sat across from Marcus in a quiet little cafe nestled beneath the persistent, drizzling rain characteristic of the fogged and shrouded city. The rustic scent of roasted coffee beans mingling with the contemplative, melancholic atmosphere seemed to create a sacred space, completely detached from the frantic, rushing wheel of the metropolis, where Marcus slowly began to paint a breathtakingly beautiful and profound metaphorical picture of the structure of existence. With a calm, forgiving voice bearing the distinct demeanor of a wise guide, he spoke, gently inviting Ellie and all of us to imagine the entire life of every small being as nothing more than a self-driving journey through a thick and endless night. Amidst the immense darkness of that cold and uncertain universe, the life vehicle of each individual is equipped with two vital elements to continuously press forward on the obscure road ahead, establishing the entirety of our human experience. The first essential element is the pair of blazing headlights striving to tear through the night, representing the attention and cognitive capacity of the human mind. Attention is not simply a passing glance, but the ultimate tool that shapes the lens of reality. It determines where we focus our efforts, illuminates the winding curves, identifies the boulders blocking the path, and dictates the fateful turns that we will bravely steer toward. How sharp the light from those headlights is, and how broad the vision is, will directly govern the depth of presence we give to the world around us, determining whether we are truly living or merely existing day by day like phantoms. However, all things constantly operate according to the law of balance, and no matter how blindingly bright the headlights may be, that vehicle will forever remain motionless in the cold if it lacks the second core element, which is the invisible fuel tank named meaning and purpose. Meaning is not a distant, abstract concept suspended in the pages of dry philosophical books, but the primal source of motivation, the burning energy quietly pushing each rotation of the wheels forward. It is the magical fuel, the only thing that provides the power for us to step on the gas, overcoming the exhausting slopes of a human life inherently fraught with suffering, confusion, and harshness. Marcus softly took a sip of hot, chamomile-infused tea, his kind eyes looking far out into the rain beating on the windowpane, slowly explaining further the miraculous way in which that fuel tank is steadily pumped full in the rhythmic flow of daily life. He reminded Ellie to relax her mind and recall the moments she strolled leisurely under the canopy of ancient trees with her soulmates, when genuine, crisp laughter blended into the whispering sounds of the forest wind, or the minutes she stood in silence, completely immersed and surrendering to the breathtaking beauty of wild nature. Right in those pure moments of connection without a hint of calculation, in an entirely natural and miraculous way, the flow of meaning from all things abundantly poured deep into her soul, pumping up the parched fuel tank to the brim, causing the vehicle of life to suddenly tremble with joyful beats and the headlights of awareness to instantly shine brighter than ever before. When we cherish a sacred friendship, when we passionately lose ourselves in a beauty that touches the heart, or when we fully immerse ourselves in a primal rhythm of the world, we are directly receiving the purest and most abundant energy of heaven and earth, allowing the vehicle to swiftly glide through the night no matter how murky the road ahead may be. Completely contrary to those fake, calculatingly busy efforts in the empty cyberspace, these deeply rooted real experiences do not drain the life of the mind in the slightest, but rather, they nourish and fortify the roots of existence, anchoring our souls to the shores of complete peace. The picture Marcus just delicately sketched is not merely a simple psychological theory, but a sharp philosophical compass pointing the way, helping Ellie and all of us to nakedly understand the operating mechanism of the life drive, inviting us to constantly question ourselves about where we are projecting the light of our attention and what kind of fuel we are silently filling up with to maintain the vehicle called life. Yet that exquisitely tranquil picture is not the eternal reality of human existence, and let us turn back to dissect to the very end the suffocating feeling besieging Ellie at exactly the moment of 3 o'clock in the afternoon on that bland Saturday. Under the invisible weight of daily worries, of the harsh grinding gears of making a living and distant expectations, the life vehicle sometimes has to strain to cross barren roads devoid of emotional resonance, causing the invisible fuel tank to gradually deplete to the very last drops. What truly happens in the mind when that fuel source called meaning runs completely dry? The headlights go out. Just like a cruel physical law of the soul, when the engine no longer has thrust, the electrical system also refuses to operate, and the bright headlights of attention immediately lose their life source. The vehicle sinks into the thick night, completely losing its ability to navigate, and that is precisely the naked experience of the boredom that Ellie is enduring. Returning to the deep conversation under the misty, rainy porch, Marcus had cleverly peeled back the linguistic shell to redefine boredom using an extremely sharp existential philosophical perspective, calling it a state of meaning withdrawal. We often easily confuse boredom with a fleeting bout of depression or physical fatigue, but in reality, boredom takes on a form that is far more sophisticated and brutal. Utterly distinct from agonizing sorrow or clinical depression, boredom is a paralyzing experience of being stripped of freedom right in the present moment. It is when you are placed under house arrest in a stretched out, dragging space and time while being completely powerless, unable to gather enough of a sliver of biological energy to direct your attention toward anything of value or anything that brings joy. In that moment, the mind yearns to be connected, yearns to be moved, yet acts like an addict in withdrawal from lacking the familiar dose of meaning, standing barren watching life pass by without finding a harbor strong enough to anchor its interest. Ellie sat there, surrounded by a myriad of entertainment choices, countless unseen movies, but because the fuel tank inside had completely bottomed out, she could not manage to lift her cognitive lens to illuminate anything. That dull, aching feeling stems from the fact that we are intensely aware of our existence but have entirely lost the reason to keep walking right in the present moment, becoming reluctant prisoners locked tight in the invisible cage of a reality totally devoid of purpose. Marcus' calm analysis was not meant to drown her mind deeper into the black hole of despair, but acted like a gentle torch illuminating the darkest hidden corner, helping her courageously name the invisible monster gnawing at her soul, thereby fully understanding that the current feeling of disgust is not a personal flaw, but a genuine alarm siren reminding her that the vehicle of life is burning with a desire to be recharged with the raw energy of the universe. To truly comprehend why the mental fuel tank of modern humans leaks so rapidly amidst a world of material excess, we need to let our imaginations take a journey through time, stepping back into the past about 500 years to admire the fiercely harsh yet incredibly fulfilling survival picture of our agricultural ancestors. In the world of magnificent fields stretching endlessly beneath the primitive sun, the concept of boredom was completely absent from their dictionary of life, not because they possessed an abundance of recreational pastimes, but because their existential structure was perfectly designed to never allow the mind's vehicle to stall on the road. Their lives were a series of physically exhausting days of manual labor, drenched in sweat and tears, facing the lurking dangers of barren nature, yet, in an incredibly miraculous way, their fuel tank named meaning and purpose was always automatically filled to overflowing every single day thanks to three massive pillars supporting the entire sky of their awareness. The first pillar was the primitive pressure of survival, where every stroke of the hoe, digging into the plowed earth, every seed of rice sown was directly linked to the question of life and death for an entire family, ensuring that the light from their headlights of attention was always locked onto a single, intensely fierce goal without the chance to stray into impractical daydreams. Next, the second pillar was the incredibly resilient, close-knit community nature, where humans were not lonely, isolated islands in the middle of an urban ocean like Ellie is now, but rather a drop of water fully merging into the great river of the lineage in the village, where personal identity did not need to be anxiously searched for or proven, because it was already destined and sheltered in the arms of tradition from the moment they cried their first cry at birth. And finally, the deepest root-pumping overflowing vitality into them was the third pillar named the grand religious narratives, a spiritual lens encompassing every nook and cranny of the universe, providing them with an absolute coordinate system to interpret all things, turning ultimate agonies into a part of a divine plan and dispelling the terror of the finite nature of human life. Under the shade of those three colossal pillars, the individual ego that constantly yearns to assert its separate existence suddenly and voluntarily vanished, smoothly blending into the vast, magnificent, and enduring collective. In the mind of a farmer 5 centuries ago, there existed no empty space for the seed of disorientation to take root. There were no bewildered Saturday afternoons questioning one's own self-worth. Because all the meanings of life had been pre-programmed and handed directly to them like a fateful blueprint that could not be refused. The absolute arrangement of destiny turned the farmers of the past into passengers peacefully sleeping on a magnificent train with a predetermined route, where all duties, rituals, and beliefs were passed down intact from one generation to the next like a sacred treasure that could not be diminished by skepticism. They did not need to ask themselves what they were truly passionate about, did not need to compare their achievements with millions of strangers on screens of illusion, and were never tormented by the pressure to self-construct the most perfect version of themselves. The dissolution of the ego into the flow of community and the divine created an invisible, soothing cradle, lifting their minds from the free fall into the abyss of existential doubt, a struggle that countless modern souls must endure alone every single day. When we look back at the magnificent fields of our ancestors with a profound empathy steeped in philosophical hues, we are suddenly struck by the realization that what we call boredom today is actually the vast void created when those three magnificent pillars collapsed, leaving behind a boundless but bone-chillingly cold space of freedom, forcing each individual to personally light the torch to search for an ideal to live by amidst a night no longer guided by the stars of destiny. As the grand light of the spiritual coordinate system and a primitive community gradually faded, we began to witness the cracking of the safety shell, where the seed of boredom first found a crevice to take root in human history. Interestingly enough, in those early centuries, boredom did not come knocking on the dilapidated thatched huts of the commoners who toiled exhaustingly to make a living, but instead it seated itself majestically as a luxurious privilege, an upper-class disease reserved only for the elite classes with abundant spare time, such as the royal aristocracy or the hermit monks in solitary, silent monasteries. It was the ascetic practitioners of the early periods, when faced with absolute silence, harsh isolation, and the infinitely uniform repetitions of religious rituals, who tasted a state of extreme mental damnation that they named Acedia, or as it is known in philosophical history by the haunting name, the Noonday Demon. The state of Acedia is not merely physical exhaustion when the sun burns directly overhead making all things sluggish, but deeper down, it is a life-threatening weariness, an ultimate paralysis of the soul when a human abruptly loses all passionate motivation to execute their sacred meanings and noble duties to the highest deity. That invisible demon sowed a draining restlessness into the mind, a burning desire to escape the present space, turning the moment of tranquility into a suffocating prison and twisting time into a stretched-out piece of toffee with no end in sight, leaving the monk drowning in a feeling of ultimate emptiness even though faith still surrounded them. For many centuries, the Noonday Demon only prowled the isolated monasteries or the melancholic, extravagant castles, but everything changed at its very roots when the brutal wheel of the Industrial Revolution began to roar, tearing apart the landscape of peaceful countrysides to erect pitch-black smokestacks reaching high into the sky. This was an epic, turning-point crossroads of civilization, when millions of people flocked to leave the land of their ancestors, leaving behind the warm cradle of the closed community to venture into the cold, colossal machines of urbanization. In the gray, dusty space of the mechanical era, boredom was officially democratized, completely escaping the stone walls of the monastery to erupt and spread to the entire masses like a silent epidemic of the consciousness. Human beings, who by nature are creatures carrying the desire to reach for complete, pristine meanings, were now forced to turn themselves into tiny gears, mindless screws bolted tightly to production lines that repeated in a soulless, suffocatingly tedious manner. Unlike farming work, which despite being grueling and dripping with sweat, was directly tied to the flourishing of the bloodline and the cyclical rhythm of heaven and earth, the mechanical operations in the factories mercilessly stripped away all semantic autonomy from each individual, completely severing the sacred connection between the laborer and their final output. They labored not to cultivate a vibrant ecosystem of their own or to offer to some supreme being, but to dedicate their meager biological energy to massive, impersonal capitalist systems, repeating a hammer strike or a molded stamp tens of thousands of times every day until their souls became entirely calloused and withered. This brutal fracture punched massive holes in humanity's fuel tank of existence, causing the sparkling light of the old meaning coordinate system to be replaced by the emotionless fluorescent lights of the machine shop, stripping away all profound reasons for humans to feel that their existence was something grand and worthy of cherishing. The Noonday Demon now no longer wore the guise of silent ghosts prowling medieval monasteries, but it had reincarnated into an empty exhaustion right on the endless production conveyor belts, and later slithered its way deep into every towering office skyscraper where people like Ellie are slowly withering away, cruelly whispering into the ears of fractured humanity that even though they are draining their strength to keep this world running, deep down inside, they remain merely misplaced puzzle pieces desperately craving a true life purpose amidst a vast ocean of meaningless and barren repetitions. To more clearly illustrate the devastation those soulless loops wreak upon the human mental ecosystem, Marcus thoughtfully took another sip of his cold tea, his eyes, etched with the crow's feet of time, narrowing slightly as he slowly recounted to Ellie the haunting encounter with Samuel, an old friend and also a postal worker who had patched together almost his entire life within the mechanical grind until the very moment of his retirement. Samuel's life, through Marcus' calm retelling, emerged like a gray, suffocating reel of film from the industrial era, where he was assigned an incredibly simple task that carried a terrifyingly destructive power over the soul, which was to repeatedly turn thousands of mailbags inside out day after day, month after month, just to ensure not a single piece of paper was left behind inside. It was not a job that required intellect, Nor did it demand dexterous skill, it merely drained the presence of a human being by turning them into a biological machine executing an eerily static process. And then, Marcus lowered his voice, speaking of the fateful moment late one afternoon many decades ago, when Samuel was diligently turning out his umpteenth thousandth mailbag in his life. Tears suddenly welled up, rolling down his wrinkled cheeks, and he just broke down sobbing right amid the chaotic piles of canvas in the post office. Samuel's cries did not originate from physical pain or a tragic family event, but were the choked-up bursting forth of a being realizing he was imprisoned in the tragedy of the myth of Sisyphus in real life, where he was cursed to endlessly roll the boulder of meaninglessness to the top of the hill, only to watch it slide down and be forced to start all over again the next morning without the slightest glimmer of hope for progress or transcendence. Unlike the farmers of the past who sweated to sow seeds waiting for the day to see the fields blossom and bear fruit, Samuel's mailbags were like a black hole swallowing all effort and living time, an eternal circulation of identical actions carrying not a single seed of meaning to sprout. Samuel's teardrops fell like an agonizing indictment denouncing the cruelty of impersonal systems that had drained dry the fuel tank of the human soul, but at the same time, through Marcus Y's perspective, it was also a razor-sharp mirror reflecting directly into the depths of the bewilderment tearing at Ellie's generation in the modern age. Ellie sat in stunned silence amidst the quiet space of the cafe, suddenly shivering as she recognized a bitter paradox that, if Samuel's tragedy was the despair of someone completely stripped of the right to choose a path and bound to a soulless, repetitive job, then the crushing boredom she was bearing arose from completely the opposite extreme, which is the suffocating weight of absolute freedom. Ellie's generation is no longer forced to turn mailbags inside out, they have been liberated from strict religious dogmas, granted the right to cast off the barriers of a closed community to freely chart the course for their lives' vehicle on a map containing countless crossroads sparkling with promises and material halos. Yet, it is precisely that boundless, limitless sky of freedom that becomes a novel and equally cruel existential punishment, because when there is no longer any sacred coordinate system or traditional mold predestining the ideal to live by, each individual must now bend their backs to bear the entire responsibility of creating and defining meaning for themselves. The massive pressure of having to manually fill the mental fuel tank amidst a world full of choices yet devoid of absolute truths has plunged people like Ellie into a state of cognitive paralysis, not knowing whether to turn left or turn right, not knowing what to believe in to be able to wholeheartedly dedicate their attention. The sobbing cries of the aging postal worker from years past and the bored sighs of the young woman in the smart apartment in the 21st century, despite being separated by eras and spatial contexts, painfully meet at the exact same bottleneck of existential bewilderment, which is the extreme emptiness when humans lose the profound purpose to justify their own presence in this vast universe, ultimately awakening us to the fact that the glittering freedom out there will forever remain a wandering burden if we do not possess the courage and wisdom to light the fire of meaning ourselves from the deep, quiet bottom of our hearts. To thoroughly dismantle the delusion that boredom is merely a harmless stillness of the mind, Marcus continued to guide Ellie deep into the mysterious labyrinths of neurobiology, pulling back the veil of truth regarding what was actually transpiring inside her skull at the exact blocked moment of 3 o'clock on that Saturday afternoon. We often carry a naive belief that when we fall into a state of boredom, our brain will also obediently sink into a smooth hibernation, leaving time to pass in carefree laziness, yet the truth seen through the scientific lens exposes a shocking paradox that the brain at that time is not resting at all, but on the contrary, it is ablaze and performing an incredibly chaotic symphony. When Ellie sat blankly in the middle of the quiet room, stripped of all entertainment, mediums and having lost the lighthouse of her life's meaning, a complex system known as the default mode network inside the brain began to erupt into intense activity. This region is the absolute source of wandering streams of thought, the origin of daydreams, and the primal land of endless, rambling nostalgic reflections. No wonder that right in that empty moment, Ellie's mind involuntarily retreated to the past to weep with regret over unfinished things, then frantically rushed toward the future to vaguely worry about scenarios that had never yet happened, and madly questioned every life and death choice of her own life with an extreme intensity of panic. That entire wandering conscious part is activated to the maximum, bringing a kind of nostalgic feeling that is both agonizing and tormenting, forcing her to nakedly confront the existential story of her own self. However, the deep tragedy of boredom lies in a fiercely contradictory extreme taking place simultaneously deep within the consciousness, which is that while the default network is roaring like an infinite storm of nostalgia, the region of the brain fundamentally responsible for maintaining focus and making decisions completely freezes over. The guiding headlights of the life vehicle are brutally cut off from their power source, creating a painful desynchronization that makes Ellie feel the emotional waves churning and crashing in her veins incredibly clearly, yet she remains utterly powerless to mobilize even the tiniest bit of willpower to reach out and alter her current reality. This agonizing fracture between a mind boiling with nostalgia and a paralyzed will incapable of acting is the very source breeding that suffocating, soul-tearing sensation that makes us just want to leave our bodies to escape. From Marcus' tranquil, wise perspective, boredom is absolutely not a flaw in character, momentary weakness of will, or a mistake of creation, but it is actually a fierce and profoundly sacred emotional reaction against the wasting of our own mental resources. It is the desperate scream of the brain upon realizing that its superior cognitive abilities and sharp analytical skills are being cruelly cast aside, not being utilized to the fullest to create or solve challenges worthy of the status of a free living being. Like a magnificent machine possessing unparalleled power but forced to idle in the void, boredom is biological fury reminding us that we were born to create meaning, to embark on great journeys rather than just sitting idly gnawing on our own bland, phantom-like existence. This deeply intertwined scientific and philosophical awareness peers through the dark shell of prejudice, shining a blinding light through the bewildered fog besieging Ellie's mind, helping her thoroughly understand to the very end the reason why her rare weekend free time had turned into a dark, tormenting experience. She was shocked to realize that the boredom agonizing her was not a terrifying empty space needing to be quickly injected with anesthetics to run away from, but rather it was the truest SOS signal from the depths of her being, an echoing alarm bell of life demanding that she bravely re-establish order for her lens of attention and seek out a worthy fuel source to awaken the part of her while currently drowning in dark slumber. That profound realization opens up a life or death crossroad on the journey of the consciousness, because when the vehicle of life suddenly stalls in the wasteland of boredom, the primal survival instinct of humans will rise up and frantically crave to search for any kind of fuel to restart the engine, even if it is a toxic fuel capable of ravaging their very own soul. Marcus called this the first dark turn that we are very prone to blindly stumble into when falling into the deep pit of emptiness, a state of damnation that modern psychologists have named the demon's intoxication or psychological sadism. It is frightening and bitter to admit that, for a mind writhing in withdrawal from meaning, creating destruction brings the sharpest thrill and the fastest effect. When the cognitive system is paralyzed and the default network is screaming inside the skull, people tend to seek out a powerful sense of control to compensate for their current powerlessness. And the crudest, most instinctual way to feel that they still hold power is to cause pain or disruption to everything around them. Behavioral researchers have exposed a chilling truth through real-life experiments, showing that when trapped in extreme boredom with no way out, naturally gentle people are willing to push buttons to crush innocent little creatures just to break the deadly silence, or voluntarily electrocute themselves to cause physical pain rather than having to continue enduring the torture of doing nothing. Shining that lens onto daily life, we suddenly understand why on suffocatingly free weekend afternoons, instead of calmly looking deep into our being, we suddenly erupt into baseless fury at our spouse quietly sitting beside us, lashing out with words as thin and sharp as a razor blade just to provoke a reaction from our partner, hoping to prove that our existence still carries enough weight to shake and tear the peaceful shell of another being. Or more subtly and commonly, we eagerly jump onto social media, transforming into hostile, anonymous aggressors, frantically hurling vicious judgments at strangers we have never even met, and then gleefully rubbing our hands and thumping our chests as we watch explosive arguments break out. Spectacularly because of our own ignorant provocation. At that very cruel moment, if you look back at the vehicle's invisible fuel tank, you will see it abruptly boiling and surging with a pitch-black liquid, supplying an incredibly fierce surge of artificial meaning that makes the headlights of attention shine brightly again under the blood-red glow of anger. We deceive ourselves, mistakenly believing we have escaped the quagmire of boredom, thinking we are bravely fighting for some noble reasoning, or at least feeling that life has suddenly become more dramatic and less tedious, but in reality, we are merely desperately quenching a brutal thirst by downing the very poison that erodes our humanity. Marcus thoughtfully recalled the curse of the Noonday Demon of the past, realizing that the demon was never destroyed by time. It merely cunningly transformed its shape from passive tedium to an active desire for destruction, inciting weak humans to cling to malice like a life preserver so as not to sink in the meaningless ocean of human existence. Sowing damage into the surrounding world provides immediate and incredibly real feedback, fooling the brain into thinking we are creating a grand impact bearing a personal hallmark, but the harsh price to pay in return is the uprooting fracture of compassion, pushing the soul to slide into a barren land where true vibrations of love can never be cultivated again. This is the most brutal existential trap that boredom casts its net to lay out, turning a sacred biological signal originally purposed to awaken creativity into a blade stained with violence, ultimately demanding that each of us forge a high level of mindfulness to identify this toxic sadistic energy the moment it sparks a tiny flame in the mind, so that from there we can courageously refuse to take a sip of that demonic fuel, resolutely protecting the vehicle of our soul from speeding out of control down the slope into the pitch-black abyss of corruption and ruin. Stepping away from the dark fork in the road of psychological sadism where humans borrow malice to cheat emptiness, let us return to Ellie in her quiet apartment to witness a second turn, more common, more soothing, but bearing an equally silent destructive power to the ecosystem of the soul. Right at that extremely boring moment of 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Ellie did not choose to lash out at anyone or hurl bitter judgments on cyberspace. She simply let her shoulders droop, sighed exhaustedly, and reached out to grab the smartphone lying obediently on the table. The act of endlessly scrolling through short videos, trivial news snippets, and colorful images on the screen was like a syringe soaked in morphine slowly dripping soothing drops into the veins of her mind. Looking at Ellie's vehicle of life at this moment through Marcus' philosophical lens, we would see it is no longer stalled and lying motionless in the desolate shadows. The engine has begun to hum softly and the wheels are slowly rolling forward at a steady pace. But look closer into the cockpit. Ellie has dropped her hands from the steering wheel and pressed the button to activate the mindless autopilot mode, entrusting the entire fate of her existential journey to a soulless algorithmic system exquisitely designed solely to imprison attention. The most terrifying thing, and also the deepest tragedy of the digital age, is that the headlights of awareness, which were originally born to tear through the uncertain night, to illuminate winding curves, and to discover the fateful intersections of life, are now brutally bent inward, only staring and lingering within a space as small as the palm of a hand emitting a cold blue light. The fuel that the phone pumps into her dry tank is not the true meaning distilled from deep connections with humans or grand nature, but it is merely empty calories for the soul, just enough to keep the mind from screaming out in confused starvation but eternally unable to ever bring a sense of fullness or completeness. Ellie sat there, her body motionless on the soft sofa, but her mind drifting aimlessly through hundreds of thousands of strangers' lives, gluing her eyes to frivolous performances and passively consuming stories pre-molded to bait cheap curiosity. Deep within that endless scrolling experience lies a rejection of being alive, a silent compromise stripping away the opportunity to rub against the rough yet authentic edges of human life. When we turn on autopilot via social media, we are choosing to live a proxy life, borrowing the lenses of millions of others to feel the world instead of navigating through the muddy puddles of uncertainty ourselves. That glowing screen does not act as a window opening up to the vast sky, but in reality, it is a hazy mirror reflecting ultimate loneliness, where the continuously blinking signals from apps are just a desperate attempt to cover up the terrifying silence of a heart that no longer knows what to cling to. Running away from boredom by gluing our eyes to a phone is just like sticking a piece of tape over a red warning light flashing erratically on the dashboard of a vehicle. We extinguish the glaring light signaling a malfunction, we ignore the current unease, but the root cause of the breakdown inside the existential engine remains intact and is growing more severe by the day. This soothing paralysis brings an illusion of absolute safety, an artificial fog easing the existential pain, helping her successfully avoid having to step out of the car in the silent, dark night. To face the bare self that is fiercely questioning the core values of life. That autopilot mode is cruel because it demands no upward striving effort whatsoever. It lulls the ego to sleep with constant little chemical rewards, making us easily forget that the ravenous call of boredom is actually a sacred invitation urging us to stretch beyond our cramped comfort zones. By immersing herself in the sparkling screen, Ellie mercilessly strangled the symphony of nostalgia and the grand ponderings of the brain's default mode network, refusing to use her sharp intellectual capacity to redraw her own map of meaning, only to voluntarily accept being a drowsy passenger in the vehicle of her own life, continuing to roll smoothly down a straight, flat, yet completely soulless and empty road heading straight toward enclosed nothingness without even realizing that she is losing the most sacred privilege of a human being, which is the right to freely dictate the direction of her soul. To thoroughly expose the brutal truth behind the safety illusion of this autopilot mode, we must dissect the deceitful operating mechanism of the very technology that is draining the vitality of our souls every single day. Marcus, with his penetrating philosophical vision, did not hesitate to point out that the smartphone in Ellie's hand was not at all a miraculous remedy to cure boredom like the way it constantly seemed to invite, but in fact, it was an invisible acid silently corroding her tank of meaning from its very bottom. We often justify our endless scrolling habits with a pathetic argument that we just need a little harmless entertainment to soothe away an exhausting day of work, yet the truth exposed on the cognitive map is far more severe. Every time her finger glides across the screen to search for a cheap dose of dopamine, Ellie is single-handedly lowering her own threshold for tolerating emptiness. The instant and constant gratification from brief, colorful content has mercilessly suffocated the patience required to absorb deep, complex experiences that demand prolonged contemplation. The mind, which was inherently born to take in the multidimensional layers of meaning of a grand novel, to listen to profound symphonies, or to immerse itself in the tranquility of nature, is now being trained to only react to flashy, sensational, and entirely superficial stimuli. When the capacity for focus is broken into tiny fragments, the structure of attention is also severely fractured, rendering the headlights of awareness no longer strong enough to illuminate a long, coherent path, capable only of blinking weakly across fleeting 15-second video clips. The inevitable consequence of this corrosion is that the vehicle of life becomes increasingly dilapidated and easier to stall than ever before. If previously, boredom only found Ellie when she was completely depleted of meaning for a long period, now, that Noonday Demon can ambush her anywhere, in any empty space, no matter how minuscule. Waiting for an elevator, waiting at a red light, or even right in the middle of a conversation with friends, with just a few seconds devoid of artificial stimulation, the bewildered feeling of emptiness will immediately rise up, inciting her to frantically rummage through her purse to pounce on her phone like a drowning person clinging to a rotting buoy. This is exactly the screen's death loop, an inescapable addiction trap perfectly designed to manipulate human neurobiology. The more bored we feel, the more we surf the web to distract ourselves. The more we surf, the more our threshold for enduring silence drops, causing us to easily fall into boredom even faster the next times. That loop just keeps tightening its grip on the soul, draining all natural vitality and replacing it with an artificial need that can never be fully satisfied. Ellie suddenly shivered upon realizing she was trapped in that sophisticated snare, using the very poison that caused the disease to try and treat its painful symptoms. Using screens to run away from boredom does not bring peace, but only creates a cowardly dependence, permanently stripping away the semantic autonomy and pushing the soul to slide down into a desolate wasteland where all deep vibrations are worn away and all genuine efforts at connection are suffocated under the 1,000-pound weight of digital vanity. Now, as the curtain of illusion has been torn down, Ellie stands at a crossroad exposing the most brutal choice, but one that also offers the strongest hope for rebirth: either continue to let the vehicle of her life drift in mindless autopilot toward nothingness, or bravely embrace a far greater pain to personally rediscover the true engine for her existence. Standing before the invisible, fateful fork in the road drawn right in the middle of the quiet room, Ellie decided to set the phone down on the table, choosing a third path that is incredibly harsh yet is the sole authentic escape route to save her soul from corruption. If the first turn is the demon's intoxication borrowing malice to trick the void, and the second turn is leaning on the technological anesthetic to lull the consciousness to sleep, then this third choice demands an immense existential courage, which is to accept throwing the door wide open, stepping entirely out of the vehicle, and using her bare hands to push the massive vehicle inch by inch through the thick, dark night. Marcus once called this exhausting act of pushing the vehicle using philosophical terms steeped in ancient wisdom, invoking the spirit of Wu Wei from the tranquil Taoism and the concept of the sweetness of doing nothing from the profound Italian culture. Wu Wei here does not carry the implication of lazy surrender or yielding to fate, but it is a supreme art of living that demands high-level mindfulness, advising us to follow nature instead of forcing the mind to be constantly busy to cover up the lonely fear. It teaches us how to relax all muscles and the cobwebs of consciousness to sink deeply into the discomfort, welcoming the surging boredom without offering the slightest judgment or resistance. When Ellie closed her eyes, bravely sitting still on the sofa instead of lunging for any electronic device to fill the void, she was truly placing her hands on the cold hood of her life vehicle and beginning to use all the strength of her soul to push. In those very first moments, the quiet atmosphere thickened as if pressing heavily on her chest. The default neural network inside her brain began to scream more violently than ever before, hurling at her a barrage of cluttered memories, anxieties about an uncertain future, and harsh interrogations about her own worth. The urge to run away, to seek out some source of stimulation to quench the thirst for meaning became agonizing to the extreme, exactly like the sensation of muscles stiffening and giving out when having to use human strength to push a giant block of metal up a desolate incline. Yet, the office philosopher had advised that it is precisely within the arduous friction of enduring that emptiness that the first sparks of a new self-awareness begin to flash. By doing nothing, Ellie was performing a magnificent spiritual surgery, clearing out the mental space, creating a sacred realm of silence to listen to the most intimate voices of her soul that have always been buried under layers upon layers of the noisy sounds of the consumer world. She realized that boredom is not an enemy that must be destroyed at all costs, but it is actually a magnificent accommodating space, a giant transparent mirror reflecting the naked form of the ego without any cosmetic illusion to cover it up. When we cease to struggle, cease trying to escape the present moment through external means, the dull pain of lacking a purpose will gradually be washed away and transformed into a state of pure observation. Ellie began to feel her own presence in the three-dimensional space, feeling the steady beating of her heart and the clean flow of air filling her lungs, she realized she was still existing fully even without any artificial light pointing the way or a borrowed coordinate system to guide her. The sweetness of doing nothing does not lie in a superficial, immediate comfort, but it radiates from the feeling of ultimate freedom when the ego sheds the 1,000-pound pressure demanding that a human must always be useful, always be productive, and always become a better version of themselves in the eyes of others. Pushing the car through the darkness by oneself is exactly the process of purifying the sludge of those fake fuels, allowing the tank of meaning inside to be cleaned out to prepare to receive the most genuine vibrations of human life. It is a glorious return to the original self, where humans learn to befriend their own shadows, thoroughly understanding the structure of their being and reclaiming absolute mastery over their attention, turning the seemingly most useless and tedious quiet moment into the most solid launchpad for all magnificent spiritual rebirths in the journeys to come. As Ellie steadfastly kept herself sitting quietly and still on the sofa, rejecting all temptations to escape through the cold screen, a miraculous transformation began to unfold deep within the biological mechanism of her mind. The process of pushing the vehicle of life by herself through the thick night initially brought an indescribably aching friction, but it is exactly from that harsh, invisible abrasion that the first sparks of primal creativity began to flash, illuminating unseen corners of her soul that had never before been explored. The words of the office philosopher resonated again like a chime of wisdom, reminding her and all of us that, throughout the long stretch of human civilization, history has laid bare a grand truth proving that the most brilliant minds, from eminent thinkers to talented artists, have never found the peak of their transcendence in the midst of a noisy environment overflowing with crammed entertainment. On the contrary, they nurtured and used the very deep chasm of boredom as the sturdiest launchpad for the spectacular breakthrough of their imagination. When the mind is entirely stripped of external stimuli, it acts like a river whose familiar flow has been blocked, forcing it to swell and carve out new, stronger, and deeper branches for itself to continue circulating. In truth, boredom is absolutely not a cruel evolutionary glitch of creation meant to punish mankind, nor a terrible feeling needing to be eradicated, but it is the most natural and magnificent biological signal that nature has bestowed upon us. Just as the sharp sting of pain warns the body to pull its hand back from a blazing fire, the extreme discomfort of sadness and boredom is an exquisite biological compass, an urgent alarm siren notifying us that we are trapped in a barren land devoid of meaning, thereby urging a fierce existential thrust that forces humans to pull up their anchors and take action to reach new lands of awareness and reevaluate the entire story of their lives. The restless, uneasy feeling that Ellie used to despise to the utmost now revealed itself in a truer form, which is the stirring of a life energy demanding to be set free, the ravenous call of a curious instinct pushing the brain to self-construct new worldviews instead of passively consuming borrowed illusions. In the ultimate emptiness of an afternoon without social media, the brain's default mode network was no longer a tormenting storm of nostalgia, but it had transformed into an astonishingly free workshop of creation, where one could learn to relax and dive into that wandering stream of reverie. Within this very space of selflessness, disjointed fragments of memory, vague ideas, and deep desires began to collide, blend, and weave together unprecedented aspirations. We often fear doing nothing, because we always carry a flawed prejudice that it equates to regression and wasting time, but in reality, it is precisely within those unprogrammed silences that the mind's vehicle truly operates at its optimal capacity to recalibrate the ultimate goal of human life. Boredom is a magical force that sweeps away all remnants of vanity, forcing us to strip off our social masks to hold a naked dialogue with ourselves, to self-interrogate what the true fuel is that has the capacity to ignite the headlights of radiant presence. By courageously anchoring herself in that silence, Ellie was not simply surviving the crisis of Saturday afternoon, but she was manually honing the compass of her soul, so that its sensitive needles would no longer be distorted by the fake magnetic fields emitted from cran technology, and instead, it would firmly point toward the dawn of genuine creativity, where every single thought that arises carries the deep hallmark of freedom and every next step taken on the driving journey through the night is illuminated by the most complete and profound awareness. Once the inner compass had been recalibrated through the harsh friction within that sacred tranquility, a matter of life and death immediately opened up on the mind's journey, which was how we truly begin to pump those first drops of meaningful fuel back into the life vehicle without tumbling back into the trap of toxic busy efforts. At this point, the wise man of the office, Marcus, did not sketch out grandiose plans or shout out massive goals for Ellie, things that are always so prevalent in mainstream self-help books, because he understood to his core that a weary soul going through meaning withdrawal would instantly collapse under the strict demands of willpower. Instead, he slowly handed her a dose of mental first aid that was incredibly simple, exquisitely designed upon the principle of low effort but high reward. The perfect first stepping stone to awaken the engine of life is an act of reaching outward, or put in more deeply rooted, rustic terms, herd connection. Carrying that empathetic advice, on a pristine morning, Ellie decided to step out of the confinement of her silent apartment, leaving her smartphone lying obediently on the table, and leisurely strolled to a bustling local farmer's market. She did not carry any pressure about having to initiate social bonds. Did not need to laboriously build deep conversations to prove her self-worth, but simply allowed her physical body and her cognitive lens to bathe in the pulsating rhythm of a vibrant community. When blending into the peacefully moving crowd, the headlights of her attention began to curiously shine upon the most ordinary things, taking in the brilliant red of ripe tomatoes, listening to the rustic, lively chatter of the street vendors, and filling her lungs with the rich aroma of damp earth mixed into bundles of tender green vegetables. The harsh contrast between the draining feeling of isolation in the digital space and the flesh and blood presence in the real world cruelly exposed our illusions about connection. On the illusory cyberspace, scrolling past tens of thousands of unfamiliar faces only drains the mind's vehicle of fuel in a disastrous manner, yet when standing silently amidst a crowd rushing with earthly joys, the energy from the beating hearts of fellow humans automatically permeates and heals the confused cracks of the consciousness in an incredibly miraculous way. We are inherently deeply social beings, programmed by creation millions of years ago to find ultimate safety and a sense of completeness when belonging to a vast collective. It is exactly that primitive herd feeling that is the oldest and most powerful fuel, the substance that once nourished the souls of our ancestors through barren, enduring centuries, now once again overflowing into Ellie's dried-out tank of meaning. There is no need for empty, deceitful praises, just a quick, friendly smile from a passerby, or a brief shared moment with a stranger glancing at a finely crafted artisanal object, is already enough power to awaken the abundant flow of compassion and ignite the sacred bond of humanity. Bringing oneself to blend into this accommodating, outward-reaching atmosphere acts like a tender pat on the shoulder from the vast universe, gently stripping away the individual ego that constantly and anxiously craves recognition, allowing the tired self the right to smoothly dissolve into the great, enduring whole. Every unhurried footstep through the bustling market, every gentle look exchanged, feels like pure drops of fuel being slowly poured into the soul's tank, carrying the weight of a miraculous ritual of rebirth, helping Ellie feel deeply that even though she might occasionally wander lost in the dark existential night, she will forever remain an inseparable part of flesh and blood in the brilliantly colored tapestry of mankind, and the vehicle of her life is ready to tremble with its first joyful beats, to slowly roll forward once more under the radiant light of a complete presence. After those drops of tranquil herd connection fuel soothed some of the burning thirst in her chest, Marcus continued to reveal to Ellie the second dose of mental first aid named the current of vanity, a decisive turning point meant to reawaken the original creative capacity and curiosity that had been stifled under the crushing pressure of the productivity era. We are living in an epoch where every personal effort is haunted by the disease of optimization, where a hobby is only deemed rational when it can generate money, where a painted picture must receive thousands of praises online, and every spare moment must be distinctly converted into measurable, practical values. Suppressed beneath that invisible weight, the mind's vehicle becomes paralyzed by the fear of failure and judgment, making us prefer to do nothing and sink deep into suffocating boredom rather than start on something that does not yield an outstanding result or a clear material benefit. Shattering that cruel prejudice, Ellie began practicing frivolity by completely tossing aside the need to create a lifelong masterpiece or some proud achievement. Returning to her quiet apartment after her stroll through the lively farmer's market, she unhurriedly laid out adult coloring books and perfectly square, brilliantly colored sheets of paper on her small wooden table, and began diligently folding clumsy origami paper cranes. Hands that were previously only accustomed to typing on keyboards now clumsily repeated simple folds, making scribbled streaks of color that occasionally bled outside the lines. All these seemingly useless and time-consuming actions held an enormous liberating power for a depleted soul. Allowing oneself to do silly, trivial things without meeting any justifying reason is how we snatch back semantic autonomy from the hands of those impersonal evaluation systems out there, affirming a truth that a human life has the right to exist and play without needing to prove its usefulness to anyone. Alongside letting her hands be busy in carefree bliss like a child, Ellie also threw open the doors of curiosity, letting her mind drift into oceans of knowledge that seemingly held absolutely no practical value for an interface design expert like herself. She read passionately through lengthy encyclopedia articles about the complex social structures of massive ant colonies hidden deep underground, immersing herself in the miraculous architectural details of those tiny insect kingdoms, and was astonished to realize just how much radiant joy it brought to let herself become obsessed with the macro things inside such a micro world. This is precisely the art of reigniting the flame of passion, borrowing pure curiosity to wipe away the dusty layers of existential doubt clinging tightly to the headlights of awareness. When attention is no longer forced to shine upon heavy, pressured, grandiose goals, but is free to playfully chase after the enchanting little details of all things, a miracle of neurobiology reveals itself once more, leading Ellie into a profound realm that modern psychologists affectionately call the flow state. Flow is the absolute inverse of boredom. It is the peak realm of transcendence where cognitive focus and the source of meaning perfectly intertwine to such a degree that the cobwebs of individual consciousness automatically dissolve into thin air. Within that miraculous state, the threatening ticking of the clock seems to halt, the rigid boundaries between the creator and the created object are entirely erased, all agonizing worries about the past or hazy panics about the future are washed away, leaving only the purest burning presence reigning in every sharp fold of paper and every wondrous line of information about ants. Discovering the radiant beauty of this frivolous flow, Ellie uprooted the invisible pressure that had always cruelly forced her to live a grand life. She understood deeply with all her heart that the vehicle of life does not always have to speed along wide highways towards sparkling achievements to be considered fully meaningful, but sometimes, allowing the vehicle to bravely turn onto a tiny dirt path overgrown with nameless weeds, stopping for hours in silence just to watch a tiny creature struggling to survive, is exactly when the soul's fuel tank is filled with the purest, most free, and enduring light of human life, a light not borrowed from the crowd but bursting forth from one's own ability to be moved by the miraculous, meaningless things of the universe. A few months after those seedlings of pure curiosity and love for small things were sown, we meet Ellie again on a quiet Saturday afternoon in the city's outskirts, as she is leisurely strolling through a vast cedar forest overflowing with rustic wood scents, and her smartphone has been obediently left behind at home. Listening to the dry leaves rustling beneath every passing footstep, a flash of familiar boredom suddenly sweeps lightly across her mind like a cold autumn wind. But this time Ellie does not panic or frantically search for a digital anesthetic to cover up that emptiness. Instead, she smiles a forgiving smile, calmly nodding to welcome that restless feeling like greeting an old friend carrying the Most sincere messages from the bottom of her heart, because now she thoroughly understands that her life vehicle is no longer running on toxic psychological sadism fuel or the false safety of a soulless autopilot mode, but is bravely marching forward powered by the perpetual engine of a complete self-awareness. Ellie's wonderfully liberating experience deep in the forest has sent each of us a deeply humane lesson steeped in existential philosophy, exposing the truth that boredom is forever not a monster that needs destroying, but is rather the most sacred biological compass urging humanity to seek true meaning, and there will never be a map in this world that is perfect, unless you possess the courage to extinguish those glowing screens of illusion, confidently take the steering wheel, and bravely drive the vehicle of your soul yourself through your own darkness to find the dawn. Those awakening messages also bring our meditative philosophical journey today to a close, and we wonder how our fellow travelers listening here feel about this story, whether it has touched any hidden corners in the busy reality of your lives. We eagerly long to hear the most genuine thoughts and feelings from deep within your hearts, so please feel free to share your thoughts in the comments section below. If you have found a bit of peace and resonance through these healing philosophical perspectives, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and hit the like and share buttons for this video so that we may have the opportunity to listen to many more fascinating and profound stories together every day. Before we part, we send our most sincere wishes to everyone watching this video, wishing you abundant health, the maintenance of a carefree and joyful mental life every day, and that you may always find eternal peace right within the tranquility of your own soul. We bid you farewell and are incredibly excited to see you all again in our upcoming videos.